Hello， 大家好，欢迎收听张小俊商业访谈录，我是小俊。这是一档描摹我们时代的商业文化和新知的访谈节目。今天呢是一期英文播客，嘉宾是特伦斯·谢诺夫斯基，他是 AI 之父，也是最近刚刚从 Google 辞职的 Geoffrey Hinton 之外的另一位深度学习的奠基人、先驱人物。38年前，他们两个人一起合作研发出了波尔茨曼机，这是一种奠定了今天深度学习基础的一种神经网络。谢诺夫斯基呢是美国的4院院士，也是全美在世的仅3位4院院士。然后他有一档非常知名的慕课，大家可以去看，叫 Learning How to Learn， 学习如何学习。如果你对深度学习的原理、大脑与 AI 的关系有兴趣，那么这期播客会是一个你的很好的参考。Terry 对当前的大模型进展呢也有一些很新颖的判断，比如说给 AI 注入情感要比注入语言更容易，以及未来每家公司都会建立自己的模型。Hi, Dr. Terrence Sejnowski.
Hello, Zhang Xiaojun.
Yeah, you can call me Bonita. That is my English name.
Oh, real? Where did you get that name? Why did you pick Bonita?
I just think it's an interesting name and it's quite lovely.
Yeah, it is. It kind of reminds me of some kind, a more Latin derivation, maybe from Mexico.
Well, when did you first decide to become a scientist? And when did you specifically choose to become a scientist in the field of neural networks, deep learning, and artificial intelligence?
Okay, well, I think I've always had a interest and also, a deep curiosity about the brain, even when I was younger. Now, when I went to school for college, I majored in physics because I thought that would be the most challenging of all the sciences in terms of the power of the theory. And that I thought that's what the brain needed. Brain needed a theoretical foundation. And of course, it's very, very complex. So I thought the tools of physics would be useful for me to be able to get that kind of training. Now, then I went to graduate school in physics. I got my PhD in physics. So I was very well down the road before I realized that if you really wanted to understand the brain, you have to understand something about neuroscience, right? The biological basis of the brain. And that's when I switched to neuroscience as a postdoc. I did a postdoc at Harvard Neurobiology, Department of Neurobiology. Medical school, and there I realized that I still needed additional training in computation. In other words, if you try to understand the brain, it's not just a physics problem or a biological problem, because the brain does something that other objects in physics don't do, which is that it learns and it can think, and so that was where computation comes in. So I found my way all the way back to computational. I founded a field in neuroscience called computational neuroscience. And I recently received a very prestigious prize, a Gruber Prize in neuroscience. So that has now blossomed. That whole field is really growing very, very rapidly. It's related to the topic that we're going to be discussing today, because it turns out that there are many, many parallels and a lot of very, very valuable discussion that you can have about comparing similarities and differences between these large language models on the one hand and the human brain on the other.
So in your long research career, one shining moment was co-developing the Boltzmann machine with Geoffrey Hinton. Did you realize at that time that this machine could make such a significant impact on the history of artificial intelligence?
Well, that was one of the most exciting times in my life, and also working with Jeff, it was a really exciting opportunity for me, because Geoffrey has very deep intuitions, computational intuitions, and we complemented each other in terms of our backgrounds. His background was psychology and artificial intelligence. Mine was physics and neuroscience. We meshed perfectly. We filled in each other's backgrounds, and we really both in terms of the discoveries we made, but also personally, I think we maintained a very long-lasting friendship for our entire lives. So, but the Boltzmann machine, as you point out, really was seminal for the following reason: that it proved that Minsky and Papert were wrong, right? Minsky and Papert, in their famous book on the perceptrons, they made some very nice proofs about the limitations of the perceptron, but they then had the opinion at the end that no one would be able to generalize this learning rule for perceptrons to multi-layer perceptrons, with many layers. And so what Jeff and I did was we found that if you extend the architecture to make the units probabilistic rather than deterministic, 0, 1 with certain probability so that it would fluctuate. Yeah, so the Boltzmann machine was an existence proof that Minsky and Papert were wrong. That, here's an example, right? And now what was beautiful about it, and still, I think, for both of us, feel that it was the most beautiful learning algorithm and architecture, very elegant. And it really was inspired by physics, which was my background. And so I loved it because it was a kind of a thermodynamic proof that we had for the learning algorithm. But it was also, what makes it different from backprop is that it was all local. You didn't need to backprop the error. You could compute, all you needed to do is compute the correlation between the input and outputs under two different conditions. One, when the inputs were present, and the other when they were taken away. And we called that the sleep phase. So you compute the correlations and you subtract them. And that was very, very effective for small networks. It required that you come to equilibrium and you have to compute the average correlation. So it took much more computing than the backprop algorithm. And so it really wasn't very efficient.
Compared to earlier neural networks like the perceptron, what aspects of the Boltzmann machine made it deep learning better, and what are its limitations?
Well, okay, the beauty of the Boltzmann machine was that it first of all admitted many hidden layers, right? You can do hidden units just like you can now for deep learning. So it was already a deep learning network way back in the 80s. I mean, we didn't call it that, but it was. I mean, you could make a deep learning. The other thing was that it admitted the learning algorithm could be used both for supervised learning, which of course with most of work out with backprop has been done, but also for unsupervised. It learned probability distributions. It wasn't just learning a mapping between categorizing inputs. It was also able to develop an internal probability distribution of the inputs, and then a very high dimensional space. So it had, those are the strengths. Limitations are, like I said, it required a lot more computing. It was very slow, and also when you had many layers, as you added layers, it required longer and longer for it to equilibrate between all the inputs going up, and it has to come down. The whole network has to basically become a single coordinated state. In physics, this is called coherence. When you're near a critical point, like a phase transition, say between water and steam. There's something very special that happens at that point. The whole system becomes coherent, and that's what we were. What we found is that the Boltzmann machine had to become globally coherent. It's still very, and Jeff put a lot of effort into showing that you could build it up layer by layer. So it's still a very viable algorithm. It's just that it needs more computing.
During those years, in fact, very few people believed that neural network-based deep learning were viable for AI, and they thought it was just kind of a joke by some self-proclaimed enthusiasts. When Professor Hinton approached you with the idea of collaboration, what did he say to you, and what did you respond to him? Why did you choose to believe in him?
Well, I met him at a small workshop here, actually in San Diego in 1979, and back then it wasn't even the way you describe it. It's as if we weren't even noticed. Nobody even cared. In other words, there's a very small number of people in the whole world internationally. We had about a dozen people at that meeting, and we were researchers. We were doing something that was different from everybody else, but nobody noticed us. We were very happy working together because we all had the same intuition, and the intuition is that these are very difficult problems that have to be solved in vision, speech recognition, language problems, and that the only existence proof that the problems were solvable was that nature had solved them, right?
Yes.
And so our view was, why not look under the hood? Let's see what nature has done for us, and let's try to reverse engineer the brain. Now, when you do that, you don't want to duplicate the technology because it's much more advanced than ours. In terms of the energy use and the scale. Even today's networks don't even approach fraction of the brain. But what you can take away from the brain are some general principles. And so that's what we try to extract and then to create our own artificial versions of the brain. And by far the most important principle that was completely missing from artificial intelligence at the time was that you could learn the weights. You could learn to solve problems by giving it examples. And that really is a very important way that the brain adapts to the world. The brain can learn language. You can learn to play sports. You can learn physics. You could learn social skills. And, in other words, these are things that are not programmed in you as if, you're writing a computer program. The part of the brain that's innate is the architecture and the mechanisms for synaptic plasticity. So these are biological mechanisms that allow the brain to be have to have the connections that when you're born that are close to what you're going to need as an adult. And what you do is refine that with learning. So those are the principles. Massively large scale, lots of connections between the units, and learning algorithms. And so that's what we focused on. And, it wasn't back then in the 80s, although the same learning algorithms that we used back then are being used today. But what's happened since then is that the scale has been unbelievably increased because of Moore's law. And in terms of the number of units and the number of parameters, it's up to 1 trillion now. Which is still, it's real small compared to the brain. The brain has about, I think, it's 10 to the 14th, 10 to the 15th, so 10 to the 12th. So it's still about 1,000 times more connections, more parameters.
How did the human brain inspire your research during this process? You once said this is the most exciting moment of your life, and we are confident that we have figured out how the brain works. So what new discoveries did you make during this process in this regard?
Okay. So, first of all, I don't want to give you the impression that we understand how the brain works. It's still a big mystery. There's still a lot. That's why I'm in neuroscience, because it's a challenge, and brains are much more powerful than any neural network model that anyone has created.
Yeah. So, do you have any new discoveries during this process?
Well, okay, so well. First of all, in my book, I have the whole chapter which shows that the architecture of convolutional neural networks, which is one of the first that made a big breakthrough in 2012 at the NeurIPS meeting that was held in Lake Tahoe, where Geoff Hinton showed that you could reduce the error on the ImageNet data set by 20%, which was like leaping into the future by 20 years. So that convolutional neural network, if you look at it, the architecture is very similar to the architecture of the primate visual system in terms of the way that the signals go through the different layers, and it's a convolutional architecture for the visual inputs coming in, pre-processing, and then there's a lot of other mechanisms like normalization and grouping and so forth that are all present in visual cortex, which has a visual cortex has about 12 layers in it in terms of the number of areas that process the information sequentially. So that was a case where convolutional neural networks were inspired by the visual architecture. And now what's happening is that a lot of the discoveries that are being made with transformers, for example, for natural language processing, and many other architectures with recurrent networks that have emerged from analyzing these networks, trying to understand how they work, have then produced tools and techniques and ways to analyze neural data. So we're making vastly great progress, with collaboration across AI and neuroscience than we were in the last century, which was very, very slow and painful. It was very complex, and it was very complicated. Just to record from one neuron was extremely difficult. But now we have tools and techniques to record from hundreds of thousands of neurons simultaneously, and it's giving us a much more global picture of how all the different neurons are coordinated together. So that's what's exciting right now, is that there's a crosstalk between the engineers and the neuroscientists, which is very, very exciting because it's accelerating our understanding of both how brain works and also how to improve AI.
What did the opponents, like those AI establishment figures like Marvin Minsky, think? What's their opinion? And looking at now, what's the biggest difference in the underlying understanding of the world between the minority camp like you believe in connectionism, you believe in deep learning and neural networks, and those another camp, the AI established camp who believe in symbolism? So what's the difference in the underlying understanding?
Yeah, okay, so in the 20th century, computers were so puny that all they could do really efficiently was logic. So AI was based on writing down logical rules, incorporated symbols, and manipulated symbols. And so people wrote programs that built up these rules and tried to solve difficult problems. And I think in retrospect, what the mistake, not mistake, but what wasn't, it was the fact that nobody really appreciated how difficult these problems are that nature solved. Vision is extraordinarily complex and difficult. The problems that the brain solves, because it's so efficient, it feels as if it's easy, right? I mean, you look out and you see objects. Right? What could be difficult about that, right? Okay, so here's a true story about the first DARPA grant. This is a big Defense Advanced Research Project Administration. It's the military research wing. The first grant that the AI lab, Marvin Minsky, got at MIT was to build a robot that could play ping pong. They got the grant, but then they realized, we did not ask for any money to write the vision program. And so they assigned it to a graduate student for a summer project.
Yes.
It seemed like it would be easy. Okay. The big AI meeting at Dartmouth, it was in 1956, and in 2006, 50 years later, it was an anniversary meeting, and I met Marvin Minsky, and I asked him, "Is this a true story?" Because I heard this, and I don't know. It seems apocryphal. I mean that it's somebody must have made that story up. And he said, "Well, you've got your facts wrong. We did not assign it to a graduate student. We assigned it to undergraduates."
I remember this story. I read your book.
Okay. Well, it's a true story, and I think that what this was what I think in retrospect is that they did the best they could with the computers that they had at the time, and what they didn't. What the problem is as the problem gets bigger and bigger, if you try to solve it with writing a computer program, the program gets bigger and bigger, and that's very labor intensive. Writing programs is extremely it's costly. I mean, in terms of paying programmers, and especially if it gets to be millions of lines of code, it doesn't scale. Okay, so that was the problem with AI in the 20th century. It did not scale, and if you need to get it up to a scale to solve the difficult problems about how the brain thinks and how language works, they would have never gotten to it, even if you gave them billions of dollars and to write computer programs that were billions of lines long, they would have still not solved the problem, right? It would have been clunky. Okay. They didn't know that. And, nobody knew that. And in fact, back then, we had these tiny little networks with one hidden layer. We could, a proof of principle that we could solve the problems that the perceptron couldn't solve. But what we didn't know was how it would scale up. What would happen if you had 10 hidden layers, right? We didn't know because we couldn't simulate that. It's too complicated, too computationally intense. So now we know. It turns out that if you wait 30 years and the computers get millions of times faster, now we can begin to solve real world problems, right? And that's something that we didn't know back then. But, we're in a situation back then where people thought that, well, maybe it's a dead end because it couldn't solve difficult problems in the 80s and 90s, but they couldn't solve the difficult problems either. So we didn't care. We're just happy to keep going and seeing how far we could get, and the other thing is that was missing from our conceptual framework back then was an appreciation of the complexity of the world. The world is a very high dimensional place. And by that, I mean incredible amount of information, just vision, for example, right? You have a camera with a megapixel, right? And, your retina has 100 megapixels, right? It's photoreceptors. The amount of information coming in is just like a fire hose. It's an unbelievable amount of information is coming in all the time. And you can't if you reduce the dimensionality, you lose the information. You can't compress it, which is to a symbol, right? The idea was a beauty of symbols was that you could compress something as complex as a word for an object, right, into a symbol. But, like cup, you could write this little symbol, and it stands for all cups, not just this cup, but all cups, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's very powerful. The problem is that if you have to recognize an image of a cup, that doesn't help you because cups come in all shapes and sizes. You can see them from different positions, from the top, from the bottom. And that is a high dimensional problem. The world is high dimensional. And it wasn't until we were able to get networks up to a size with trillions of these parameters that we could begin to absorb the complexity of the world into the network in a way that it could recognize objects, recognize speech, and then now natural languaging. Not only does it recognize, it can generate speech, right? We've closed the circle now. I mean, this is like in fact, this is really exciting and very interesting because what we've discovered is that, remember I was talking about phase transitions, where you go from one state to another, like going from a liquid to a steam, or actually even better example is you go to iron that is unmagnetized at high temperature, but as you lower the temperature, it becomes a magnet. That's a phase transition. Well, it turns out there are phase transitions in networks as they get bigger and bigger. In other words, up until some point, you can't make much progress, say, with object recognition and images. It's very poor performance. But suddenly, once you get to a certain size, it starts getting better and better and better as it gets bigger. So there's a minimum amount of complexity that you need to solve a problem. But and as it gets bigger and bigger, it gets better and better and better. And to solve language problems, there was another phase transition that occurred. It was another bigger network yet, and so forth. And what we're discovering is that as you get bigger and bigger networks, they can do more and more complex things. They behave more and more intelligently. And that was something, again, that no one expected, that there was a minimum amount of complexity that you needed. And that's really why we've made these great advances, is that we've been able to scale up the computation. And now what people are doing is building special purpose hardware to scale it up even further. So it's going to keep going. This is just the beginning. We're just, and here's the analysis. Okay, I'm going to give you, I'm not sure if you remember this from the book about the Wright brothers, who were the first to have manned flight. We were back then, there was an analogy people would make that, if you want to build an airplane, then watching, birds, you're not going to learn anything from birds, flapping their wings, right? Ha ha. Well, there's a biography by David McCulloch, a beautiful biology of the Wright brothers. And here's what happened. They spent a lot of time watching birds when they're not flapping their wings, but they're able to glide. Have you ever seen birds just glide? They on the cliff here, we have a cliff, and we have these seagulls and crows. And there's the 300-foot cliff, and the wind comes up, and they can go for an hour without flapping their wings. And not only can they do it, but so can humans, because there are paragliders out there, people with these parachutes and also hang gliders. They can go back and forth for many hours, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that's because wings can hold you up. And that's what the Wright brothers were interested in. So they built a wind tunnel, and they designed a wing that could hold them up. And now what about feathers, right? What are you going to learn about flying by looking at how feathers are made, what the material is and so forth, right? And then everybody would say at that time, that's silly. We've got metal, which is much better than the feather, right? Because it's stiff and so forth, and we can make it very big and so forth. And why bother with feathers? All the attempts to build airplanes out of metal failed miserably because metal is very heavy, right? And engines not very strong. Okay, so here's what the Wright brothers did. Okay, well, the feather is very stiff. It has a very stiff quill that goes up the middle. So let's build a wing made out of wooden spars, right? But only a few. We're not going to build it out of all wood, because what we're going to do is we're going to put canvas, right? Just like the feathers. The feathers are extremely surface area, high surface area, but very light. And so we'll put canvas between the wooden spars. And that way we'll have a big surface area, very light, just like the bird wing, right? So what they did was they took the principles, not the details, the principles. Okay, and in Kitty Hawk, they didn't get very far off the ground. They got like 10, 20 feet off the ground, and it didn't go very far, maybe half a mile or something. But it was proof of principle that this is going to work. And over a period of the wings evolved and the engines evolved, and it took a long time. And by the way, the most difficult problem that they had to solve was control. How do you control the direction it's going, right? That's a very, very important problem that was only solved a little bit later by putting wing flaps that would go like that. Again, if you look at birds, that's what birds do. They twist their wings when they want to turn right or left. This is like, so that nature is an infinite source of ideas about how to solve very complex problems, and you have to be a good observer. You have to look and understand, see through the details, see what is the underlying ideas, what are the underlying concepts that were nature used, principles, and that's really, I think, what Jeff and I and others at the time were trying to do, is to see in this new architecture, this massively. Okay, now let's step back and talk about computers, right? Up until recently, the only game in town was the von Neumann architecture, where you have a processor, you have a memory, and you have a bunch of instructions that you program, and that is incredibly powerful, because you can solve a lot of simple problems that way, right? Keeping arithmetic, you can keep track of a huge amount of data, and you can sort and search, and there's no doubt that we've made a huge amount of progress because these computers have allowed us to simulate other architectures, right? Parallel architectures are very, very difficult if you use programs, are very difficult to organize, and the supercomputers now are massively parallel with hundreds of thousands of cores, right? And it's very difficult to coordinate all these cores. And I just went and visited a supercomputer center in Texas, and they said that it's what makes it difficult is the speed of light is actually not infinite, right? It goes about a foot in a nanosecond, about that far in a nanosecond. Of course, a nanosecond is a clock's time for a nanosecond, gigahertz. And so the wires between the cores turns out to be critically important, the time delay. And so nature had to deal with the same thing. There are time delays between neurons. And nature has solved that problem. Nature has figured out how to solve that problem. That's the problem I'm working on right now, is how did nature solve it? And can we take that into account when we build our massively parallel architectures and continue to scale it up? So there's so much more we're going to learn from nature.
I also read another very interesting story from another book. It's like the history of the deep learning revolution. And in this book, there is a story. It's like you once asked Marvin Minsky, "Are you the devil?" Did you really say that to him?
It was that meeting I was telling you about, the 50th anniversary meeting. He's a very smart guy, but it turns out that even smart people make mistakes.
Of course, yeah.
And even the best of us. And I don't blame him, at the time when he made his decision to go in one direction. But he unfortunately, a lot of people in neural networks felt that because of his book, but also just because of his influence, he was very powerful in terms of funding major. He is being the head of the AI lab at MIT, founder of the AI lab at MIT, and also all of his students went and got great jobs at Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, so he created a whole, field around his vision of AI, right? And so look, I was at this meeting, and it was pretty clear for me, the idea, the purpose of the meeting was let's look back at our successes and think about the future, right? And it was pretty clear to me that every single person there who was making progress not because of the old-fashioned writing programs, but because they were taking advantage of large data sets, both in vision and in language. Just, for example, parsing sentences. Gene Cherniak, who was a student of Marvin Minsky and Noam Chomsky, he said, I couldn't parse, worth anything by using symbol processing. But as soon as I got a hold of a big corpus of parsed sentences actually got my students to do this for me, I was able then to look at the statistics of words and, the common words that came in pairs and triplets and so forth. And now by just taking that and seeing how the new sentences are formed from similar combinations, we were able to solve that problem. And, my God, it was, everybody said, it wasn't until you were able to sample the complexity of the statistics of the world, there was no progress. And at the end, Minsky said, he got up and said, shame on you to students. You're a failure because you're working on applications. You're not working on general artificial intelligence. I was in the audience. I wasn't one of his students. I talked about reinforcement learning and how temporal difference learning was able to solve and become champion level backgammon player, Jerry Tesaro, who was a colleague of mine and student. He dismissed that as a game, right? But even though it was creative, it actually was able to. And now, on steroids, the story about Go and DeepMind, right? I mean, that basically was the same architecture, with just more units and more hidden layers, same algorithm, temporal difference learning. But we didn't know back then that would scale up to be able to solve even more complex problems like Go. But he was very, I thought, very close-minded, and I felt sorry for his students. I felt that this guy, I'm willing to say he's a pioneer, but he's holding us back. He's holding us back. We all of the students want to go forward, and working on these applications is a good way of doing it, right? Because you come to grips with the complexity of these problems. And in any case, I was pretty pissed off, I have to say. And so at the final banquet, where at the end, each of the people, there were 12 people there who were at the first meeting, including Minsky, and everyone said, gave a brief speech about what they thought about the meeting, and that was good. And then there were, audience questions for the audience. So I put my hand up. I asked, Dr. Minsky, there are some people in the neural network community who think that you're the devil because you held back progress for decades. Are you the devil?
Wow.
In public, I said this. I had to say that, it was not. I mean, I'm not usually like that. I mean, I'm pretty even-going guy, and I don't often confront someone like that. But I really felt that he had to be called out.
Yes, you feel very angry.
I actually, at that point, I wasn't angry so much as I was, like I said, I thought I was angry not because of what he said, but the way he said it to his students. That's, you don't treat your students that way. Your students are, your family. It was just violated my sense of, being human and being able to help people rather than to hurt them, right? Which is what he was doing, abusing his students, and I don't like that. Okay. In any case, whatever the reason, I asked him this question: are you the devil? It was clear that I pressed his button. Do you know what that expression means? That means that it was like suddenly he started spouting all kinds of things, right? I mean, he just went off saying, you don't understand about complexity. You don't understand about the what computation is really about. And he went on and on. And finally, I stopped him. I said, Dr. Minsky, I asked you a yes/no question. Are you or are you not the devil? It's a binary question. Yes or no? Yeah. He kind of sputtered, and then he stopped. And he said, yes, I'm the devil. And, I put him in the corner, and I have to say it was unfair of me. But, the reality is he was the devil. And, and it made I think the audience was shocked that of this confrontation. And I know a couple of people that came up to me afterwards and thanked me, said that, it really was something that everybody was thinking. And, it was really sad that the way he behaved and so forth. But in any case, that's all history. And again, in retrospect, I actually think that it wasn't him. It was the whole field had congealed around a paradigm that wasn't working. The whole field had these, as you said, you have a bunch of questions. You had booms and busts, and what that reflects is the fact that they were making progress, and sometimes they made a little bit of progress that looked very promising, and there would be a boom, and then there'd be a bust when you realize that actually it didn't solve all the problems. And there's, this is by the way, this is true of all areas of science and engineering. It's all boom and bust. There isn't any exception like that. There's, you make progress in these brief periods where suddenly you have a new theory or a new paradigm, and then you see how far you can take it. And when you reach the limit, now you have to wait for the next breakthrough, right? That's natural. And like I say, every area of science goes through the same process over and over and over again. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's just the way things are.
So today, with the emergence of ChatGPT and AI explosion, has it exceeded the most optimistic expectations? Has the emergence of large-scale language models brought about a new paradigm of deep learning?
Yes, absolutely. In a number of crucial ways, and we've already alluded to it, which is that most other neural networks were not generative. They were simply feed-forward classification. The one exception is GANs, generative adversary networks, which could do things that were very, very interesting in terms of being able to generate, like if you give it a bunch of faces, it could generate new faces, right? So that was an example of a generative network, but it was actually two networks. One was generating, one was selecting. It was trying to detect whether it was real or it was generated, and so is it like a battle between two different networks, and they could get better and better at generating and at detecting. Okay, now the real breakthrough with these generative models was, in my mind, right there are a lot of really interesting technical details that were really important for the success, but I think by far the most important was the fact that they use self-supervision. So instead of having labeled data, which is what you do with objects, right? You label the picture. That's supervised learning, and that varies costly because you have to have humans to do that, right, to get the ground truth. But with self-supervision, you can just use the data itself. It's a form of unsupervised because nothing's labeled. The beauty is that all you need to do is train it up to predict the next word in the sentence, and so you can give it all the sentences from every place, and that's more training data. So the training data is basically semi-infinite, right? It's like suddenly that's no longer a constraint. Before it was, you had to have, as the networks got bigger, you needed more data. That was for sure, and that limited the size of the network could be. If you have a small data set, it's a small network. So, but now there's no limit. People can just keep getting bigger and bigger, and we'll see how far that goes. But that really, I think, shifted everything because began to emerge were unexpected things. I'd never expected. Nobody expected the capability that these large language models have. Okay, and the thing that surprised me was the fact that they could speak in English, and I know in other languages too, but the English that they speak is perfect.
Yes.
No, I mean, it's like, they don't make grammatical mistakes like most humans. Yeah, I write, I make grammatical mistakes. I mean, when I talk, I make all kinds of grammatical mistakes. We all do, right? Because we're not perfect. But how the hell did it get to be so good at grammar? Nobody really knows. Well, it had access to lots of words and lots of sentences, but they weren't all perfect either. I don't know. But in any case, that's a deep mystery. And it also is a counterexample to Noam Chomsky, who claimed that the only way that you're going to be able to come up with a machine that can use grammar is by using his theory, right? He has a theory of generative grammar. It never worked. There's a whole field of computational linguistics that tried, it doesn't work. His theory doesn't work. And then he said that learning will never work either. Again, he said something, he said, not because he could prove it. He just said that it's implausible. I can't imagine. That's literally what he said. I cannot imagine something as crude as learning, being able to learn something as complex as language. And, that was his intuition. He was completely wrong. Someone can be extremely smart and stupid when it comes to things that you don't know anything about, right? He didn't know anything about learning. Why is he becoming an expert about learning when he says something he can't prove? He just says, well, I'm the smartest person in the world, and I can't imagine it. Well, everybody said, well, he's pretty smart. Maybe he's right. So, and he, more than Minsky, I would say, held back not just AI, but cognitive psychology and linguistics and whole fields that were based on his thinking stagnated for decades and decades. In fact, it's only now that linguistics is being resuscitated, and because we have to understand how these large language models work. And it's giving us a new insight, though we didn't have before now. So we're making progress, right? So linguistics is basically being revived after all these decades. It's really exciting to be seeing that happen.
So why is ChatGPT so clever? Why is so smart?
Oh, well, I'll tell you, there's a big controversy about that. Okay. Very big, the intellectuals love to argue with each other. And the big topic of debate right now, which is raging, and there's differences of opinion across the whole spectrum. And there are some people who say these large language models don't understand what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand the way we understand. And they're not intelligent. And then they throw slurs, like they say, oh, these are stochastic parrots. The fact is, parrots are extremely smart. So, it's like, actually, by comparing it to a parrot, that's pretty high praise. What they're revealing, and then there are other people who think that, oh my God, they're smarter than I am, because they know so much, right? They have this knowledge base that I don't have. And some people think not only are they intelligent, but they're sentient. That is to say, they can think like humans, and they have minds like humans. So, that's the extreme, though, the two extremes, and everything in between. This is something that happens very rarely, where you have something that suddenly appears out of nowhere, and we're completely at a loss. It's as if an alien suddenly appears from somewhere, outside of the earth, and starts talking to us in English. What? I mean, and it's exactly what's happened right now. And the only thing we can be absolutely sure of is that it's not human. It's not human. It's an alien. But what is it? We've created something that, it looks like, it has some of the characteristics of being intelligent, and it certainly knows a lot, but it has problems. First of all, it makes things up. They call it hallucinations, right? This, that if you, sometimes it gives you things that look plausible, but it's just made up. It's not true. So that's one problem. Another problem is that because it's been exposed to so many different views, including a lot of people who you don't agree with, it sometimes says things that offend you, right? Well, but that's true of humans. I know people who say things that offend me too, right? So, maybe it's mirroring us. And I have a paper where I said that the mirror hypothesis, that it's mirroring us. It's like looking in the mirror, okay, for humans when they have an interview with ChatGPT, more than just asking it a question, but getting involved in a way that, like, for example, in the New York Times, Kevin Roose had this 2-hour chat with GPT, and it was completely, shook by what happened, this interaction. It was emotional for him, right? That's because it was mirroring him. It really was in a way, it was reflecting his own needs and his own thinking and what was on his mind at the time. But here now is an insight, which by the way, I'm writing a new book about these new language models, and I've already written this long paper that I'm expanding into a book for MIT Press. So it'll be out later this year. And I think I've understood something that no one else does. You can't blame GPT-3. They didn't have parents. They didn't have anybody who helped them go through this process of, by the way, this is reinforcement learning. The way that this happens would be there's a part of your brain that does what's called reinforcement learning, which is, it's actually below the cortex. It's called the basal ganglia. And this is the part of the brain that learns sequences of actions to attain goals. And this is the part that needs feedback from the world about, what is good and what's bad. And that reinforcement learning system is the part of the program that was a core part of AlphaGo. AlphaGo had two parts. It had a deep learning network which had pattern recognition for the board, for the positions. And it had a reinforcement learning engine that assigned value to all the positions, right? So they had these two parts. You need both. These large language models don't have a value function. And, and that's one of the things that's missing. In fact, that's one of the beauties, is that we could look at the brain and say, well, how does the brain get past these problems? Well, they have this basal ganglia. It's a huge thing sitting there. And by the way, it's also important for learning how to do things by practice, like playing the violin or supports. We're not coordinated when we're born. Babies a long time. They put things in their mouth and they hit things. But eventually they get up and they walk, and they can now grab things and able to run around and do things. Okay. But to get good at a sport requires specialized practice, right? You had to play many, many games. And the more you played, the better you got. That is reinforcement learning. You have used your basal ganglia to learn sequences of actions that make you good at hitting the ball, sensory motor coordination. So that's a part of the brain that's absolutely essential for being a human. It's missing, these large language models.
That reminds me that lots of people now feel very scary because they think maybe we create a monster. Also, how do you view Hinton's decision to resign from Google? He even expressed some regret about his lifelong work.
Well, I know Jeff extremely well. We've talked a lot about this, and I think it's really important. We think about the worst case. In other words, what you need to do is, so the best, when the new technology suddenly is discovered, created, it could be used for good and bad. And there will be people who will do, one person will use it for something good in society, and another one will use it for something bad, right? So the question is, what's the worst case of badness, right? Is it the case that if the bad person uses it, can they do real damage to our civilization? And so it's really important for us to imagine that. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble. And so the way that you prevent the worst case is by, first of all, understanding what's possible. And we're not there yet, but we don't really know where it's heading. We don't know. Nobody knows. And so we have to be cautious, right? And I think Jeff is being cautious, saying, let's wait a second here. Where's it heading? And what's going to happen? And this is now my view. My view is that you have to regulate it, just like everything is regulated. Every aspect of life, every technology is regulated, right? For example, you buy food in the supermarket. Well, it turns out there are bad people out there who could poison you. And they did in the past, right? So how do you ensure the fact that you're not going to get poisoned by some food you buy, right? We have a Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, that tests food to make sure that it's not bad for you, right? The regulations have to evolve just like the foods evolve, right? So you have to always constantly be testing. And that's true of everything. Airplanes, FAA tests airplanes to make sure that they don't have failures, right? Like Boeing had recently, right? And so it's just like it's another technology. There's nothing, I don't think it's that going to be, different in terms of how it evolves. It's going to evolve just like all the other technologies, like the Wright brothers. Wright brothers went from this little airplane that went at about 50 miles an hour to jet engines, but that took 100 years. It took 100 years. And so if anything's going to happen here, it's going to take 100 years before a lot of people now are thinking really hard about that. So I'm the president of a foundation that runs the NeurIPS meeting. It's an annual meeting that's held every year in December. This meeting has grown from just a few hundred people. I've been running it now for the last 30 years, since the 90s. It's been growing by leaps and bounds every year. It's amazing. It's now in the last year we were in New Orleans. There were, I think we had like 16,000 people in person and 3,000 online. So like 19,000 hybrid. This meeting has not just grown, but it has the energy, the youth, all of the ideas. People are doing things, really exciting things, and it's not just people who come to me are not just people who are machine learning people. These are physicists and biologists, neuroscientists, engineers, climate people. They all want to use the tools, so they come to the meeting to find out what the latest and greatest tools are. Right? And we have workshops where they can get together. It's really exciting. This meeting is so exciting. You have no idea the energy, the brilliance of the young people coming up. They're going at it. I mean, this is amazing. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that the community is very, very aware of the problems, the shortcomings, the problems with fairness, the problems with reliability, and potentially existential threats.
Mm-hmm.
And we bring in experts, ethics experts, and we bring in experts that like deep fakes. What impact is it going to have on society? Where are we? I mean, or GB3, what impact is it going to have on education? It's the only place where you get all the opinions of all the people that, like Jeff on one hand, and other people who just want to build things and make money. It's like all the big companies are there. They have booths. They're hiring. Everybody's recruiting. I'm not sure about this year because I know that they've been firing a lot of people. But I understand from my friends at Google that the AI people are not being fired because that is central to their core competence, right? AI is every company is trying to incorporate it into every one of their services that they have, that like search. These are really important issues, and like I said, ultimately they have to be regulated. The problem is, how do you do that without stifling research? In other words, if you say somebody, I forgot who, there's a group of people that wanted a moratorium, that we should cap the size of the network so no network is bigger than a certain size, right? GPT-4 with 1 trillion weights. That's not the way to do it. That's ridiculous. What you should be capping is the capability, not the size. It's like saying nobody should be taller than 6 feet. And, nobody should be taller than 6. We should all make sure that nobody could jump any higher than anyone else. So we're going to keep people from growing. That's ridiculous. You have to make rules that are sensible, that allow growth, but controlled growth that where you're testing it along the way to see is there something new emerging here? In fact, one of the problems is we don't know what it's capable of, right? These are things that we didn't put in it, things that are just emerging, like, the ability to program computers or the ability to write poems and things. This is like, this is things that we didn't put in. We just gave it a bunch of data, a bunch of text, corpora, and so forth. We have our job cut out for us. We have to be able to test and approve. We should have some approval process before we let them loose on society. So in any case, that's happening. I'm not worried. I'm glad that Jeff is worried because someone should be, and he's very smart, and so he'll figure out if there's something for us to worry about. But I really think that we're at the very beginning. We are the Wright brothers of AI. Literally. We just got off the ground, and we don't know how to control the airplane. We need to figure out how to control it. And that's really what I think is going to happen over the next decade.
Here are some technical questions. Currently, deep learning models require a large amount of data to achieve good performance. How do you think we can reduce dependence on large data size to achieve more efficient learning?
So I read one of your articles, Stay or Leave, Chinese tech workers caught in Silicon Valley's big tech layoffs. Very well written, by the way. And in it, you point out that these large language models are gargantuan because there's so much data out there. But there are a lot of people out there now that are building smaller models that are focused on smaller data sets. And so they're going to be these, it may be a small language model. But the point is that there'll be a lot of special purpose models out there. Each company will have its own special purpose model for its own data set, that it doesn't have to go to the cloud, doesn't need anybody else to listen in on it. A lot of companies now are not, they banned GPT-3 in the company because, of course, these companies, Microsoft and Google, they're going to take up all of they're going to figure out what people in the company are doing on the basis of the questions they're asking, right? You don't want to give away your secrets, right? That means that ultimately these models are going to be, and they may not be small, but the point is that right now it's very expensive to build one. Tens of millions of dollars, months of computer time, big, massive computers. But in the future, computers are going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So people are going to be able to build their own models within the next 10 years. Every company will be building its own models. That's a prediction. I'm going to put that in my book. Okay, so I should be going though because my wife is expecting me. But are there any other questions? Fast questions I could answer.
Okay, and does ChatGPT have emotions?
Well, it has surrogate emotions. In other words, it read all kinds of novels where people have emotions. It can simulate emotions. It knows what emotions are. It understands emotions, I think. When you're interacting with it, it can create emotions in you, right? That's what I mean by the mirror hypothesis, that it will pick up your emotions. If you're angry, it will pick that up and it will reflect it back to you. So I think that no, the answer is it doesn't have the emotions internally. Oh, that's my wife. Okay, I'm gonna line for a minute here. Okay, my wife gave me 5 more minutes. She was expecting me to be home by now. But in any case, however, that having been said, we understand a lot about emotions in our brain. And so just like fixing the ability of GPT to be able to learn sequences and so forth by putting in the basal ganglia, we can put in emotions. We know a lot about emotions, and it's going to be easier to put the emotions in than it did to put in language. And by the way, there's a lot of things in the brain that they're missing. Long-term memory, the fact that you remember our discussion tomorrow. GPT-3 does not. GPT-4 does not remember from one day to the next, right? We know what part of the brain is responsible for this, called the hippocampus. So why not just simulate the hippocampus and we'll get a long-term memory? And there's dozens of parts of the brain that are missing from these large language models that will almost certainly be added over the next decade. As you add more of these parts of the brain, there are literally 100 parts of the brain that evolve for all these different subcortical functions. And all we have now is the cortical part. It's really a stripped down human, is if all we have is a very high level, but none of the low level stuff, like the sensory motor stuff, right? It doesn't have any senses. It doesn't have any motor output. But that can be done. I mean, we have robots. We'll give it a body. We'll give it cameras, right? Well, and by the way, it's all being done. All of this is going on. I have friends in these big companies. They're doing it. It's going to happen. And so it's just a matter of more effort and more time. We're just, like I say, this is the Wright brothers. We're at the very beginning of a whole new era. This is, it's like going from industrial revolution. You have the steam engine enhances physical power, right? One farmer can plow a field with a steam engine that would take 100 farmers, right? That's physical power. And we have now the ability to enhance cognitive power. One lawyer using these large language models can do the work of 10. So that's the future. That's the future. And one thing for sure is that the most important things that will come out of it are ones that we can't even imagine, that we don't even know about yet. And you mentioned education. I think it's going to revolutionize education. There's no doubt about it. Is that, in other words, what children really need is one-on-one with adults. And if we can get a really good tutor, large language model that is good at tutoring children, it could serve not only as a teacher, but also as a mentor, helping the child navigate and helping the parents teach the kid what's good and bad.
What are the things deep learning will never be able to do?
That's the question, which is completely unknowable. In other words, nobody has a proof of something that can't be done. And the reason is that it's still evolving. In other words, even if it can't do it now, doesn't mean it can't do it with the next generation. Like I said, there's a scale thing here. With every increase in scale, there's new capabilities. So right now, if anybody tells you that, it can't do general artificial intelligence, right? Well, just wait for tomorrow. It's a moving target. And this is the problem all along in AI, is that whenever you accomplish something, people say, that used to be AI, but now that's just pattern recognition. That's not real intelligence, right? At some point, you get to the point where, come on, it will add all these capabilities, all these parts of the brain, so that it will, in some ways, have what we call general artificial intelligence. Not yet, but there's no rule or law that will prevent it.
Okay, my last question. Is humanity just a transitional stage in the evolution of intelligence?
The singularity people talk about this, but again, that's too early. That may be one scenario, but the future is always more interesting than anybody imagines. I never could have imagined what the impact the internet would have on the world, and I can't imagine. Nobody can imagine the impact that these large language models are going to have in the world. It's too early, and I think that we have to be very careful. I'm not saying that just go ahead, barrel ahead. No, we've got to be very careful. We've got to regulate. And if we don't do it ourselves, the government will do it for us. But it's exciting. This is amazing. We're entering a whole new era in human history. This is it, right? We've got here. We're at the doorstep. This is the doorstep. We are going through this door, and nothing will ever be the same again. Never. Everything will be transformed in your lifetime.
好啦，这期节目就是这样。如果你喜欢我的节目，欢迎前往苹果 Podcast、腾讯新闻、小宇宙、喜马拉雅、QQ 音乐订阅张小俊商业访谈录。如果你有其他想邀请的嘉宾、想听的内容，或者你有任何想探讨的话题，都欢迎各位听众朋友们在评论区里留言。那我们下集再见，拜拜。